The wind, a bit like judgment that morning, sharp, mean, and unrelenting. Snow laced the wooden rooftops of the town square, quieting the world except for the groan of the gallows rope as it swayed in the cold. Folks gathered like crows, collars turned up, eyes flat. No one smiled. No one cried. The woman stood barefoot in the frost, her brown shawl clinging damp to her shoulders, a fraying hem dragging in the slush. Her wrists were bound in front of her, raw from the rope's bite. Her face was gaunt, mouth tight, eyes vacant, as though whatever had once filled them had frozen over long before the snow arrived. She didn't beg, she didn't weep. She only stared at something far beyond the buildings and the gawkers, and the preacher's mumbling prayers she stole from the general's shelf the sheriff had told them. Bread and an apple, said it was for her baby. The storekeeper snorted. There ain't no baby. Starving's no excuse, someone else muttered. You steal, you hang. The sheriff looked bored. He adjusted his gloves and gave the nod to hangman, face half covered in scarf and apathy, moved toward her. The noose was already hanging like a question that didn't need answering. It touched her shoulder. Still, she didn't flinch. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were on the sky now, wide and empty, searching for nothing. Then the sound of hooves broke the stillness. A black horse, dusted in frost, stepped out of the pine edge beyond the chapel. Its rider said nothing, just moved slow and certain, toward the crowd. No one recognized him at first, not until the horse stopped 10 feet from the scaffold, and the rider sat straight in the saddle, face shadowed beneath a weathered brim. It was Thorn. He hadn't been seen in town for near 3 seasons. Lived on a ranch beyond Dry Creek, alone since his wife's grave was filled with stone and silence. Folks whispered his name, like they might whisper at ghosts. He didn't get off the horse. He didn't ask questions. He raised one gloved hand, pointed at the girl, and said 5 words. She's mine now. Let go. The words cut through the snow. The sheriff stiffened. Now hold on, but Thorn didn't repeat himself. He didn't lower his hand, just waited. The crowd watched. Tension spread like a crack in river ice. Someone coughed. The hangman looked at the sheriff. The sheriff looked at Thorn. And then, with a quiet sigh, he nodded once. No law here worth testing that look. The rope was pulled away. Her knees buckled. She fell like a marionette, with strings cut, landing hard on the frozen planks. No one reached to help her. No one dared. The preacher stepped back. A boy in the crowd snickered. The woman didn't rise. She stayed crumpled, breathing heavy. Arms still bound, head bowed in dirt and old blood. Thorn tossed something from his saddle. It hit the ground near the gallows post, a silver coin, dulled and scratched. Then he turned the horse. She still hadn't moved. He circled back, reached down, and with one arm lifted her up like she weighed no more than a sack of wheat. Didn't resist. Her eyes were half closed. He placed her behind him, securing her with one arm across her thighs. Her feet dragged in the snow. The crowd parted. No one said thank you. No. One asked why. And when the snow started falling, soft. At first, then heavy, it buried the noose like it had never been tied. The road to his ranch was long and winding, lined with brittle fence posts that leaned like tired old men. The sky had grayed by the time they reached the gate, snow clinging to the roof of the barn like frostbite. She didn't ask where he didn't tell. Her head leaned against his back, not from trust, but from exhaustion. He helped her off the horse, but didn't touch her again. She limped behind him, arms bound under her shawl, the wet cloth stiff from the cold. The cabin was plain to windows with cracked glass, one lantern flickering low on a nail. When he opened the door, warmth spilled out in waves, not enough to comfort, but enough to sting. She paused on the threshold, half expecting to be pushed. Inside, like cattle, he stepped back, letting her decide. She entered. The inside smelled of wood smoke, iron, and worn leather. A single bed was pushed against the far wall. A narrow stove glowed faintly in the corner. Beside it, a rocking chair with a hand-woven cushion, faded red and stitched with a bird that had lost most of its wings. Cracked kettle hissed on the stove top. She didn't speak. He untied her wrists with a knife from his belt, turned, and went back outside without a word. She tried to undo her boots, but her fingers trembled too much. Instead, she stumbled toward the fire, collapsed near it, and curled into a ball, blankets still soaked. He returned minutes later, tossed a dry one across her shoulder, and hung her shawl by the stove. She didn't thank him. That night, she didn't sleep. She watched the flames move like ghosts across the floorboards, listened to the creak of the rocking chair moving on its own. She traced patterns in the dust beside her, her breath fogged before her lips. She didn't know if the cold was outside or inside. Behind her closed eyes, images pulsed like open wounds, a crib with no sound, a roof burning under moonlight. A man in a miner's jacket walking out the door and never returning, the way her hands had bled trying to dig through ashes. In the silence, she heard boots move across the wooden floor behind her. She flinched, but he said nothing, just stoked the fire, then returned to his side of the room. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask why he saved her. When the wind howled through the shutters and a branch scraped against the roof, she finally rose and opened the door. Snow whirled in like memory. She stepped out barefoot, nightgown clinging to her knees, and tried to run. She didn't even make it past the well. The snow was sharp as glass, slicing her soles. Her legs gave way. She didn't cry out. But he was behind her again, silent and swift. He lifted her from the snow, as if she weighed nothing. No questions, no reprimand. He carried her back inside, set her beside the stove, and tossed another log into the fire. He left a crust of bread on the table. She stared at it. Half of her wanted to throw it. The other half ate it slowly with trembling hands, while he turned his back to give her the illusion of pride. The rocking chair creaked again. Neither of them spoke. But when she finally slept, face turned toward the stove, quilt draped over her shoulders, the stitched bird didn't look quite so broken in the firelight. The first wind struck like a warning, low, guttural, curling down from the ridge like a growl from the throat of the mountain. The sky went gray by noon, and by afternoon the snow began falling sideways. She stood at the window, watching it erase the world beyond the fence. The horses had been brought in, the chickens locked away. Only the cold roamed free now. She wrapped the quilt tighter around her shoulders, then rose. "I can help," she said, voice hoarse. He didn't look up from where he was sharpening. "The hatchet near the door? You shouldn't walk on that foot. It's mine to walk on." He paused, then stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out. She followed. The snow bit like teeth. She carried what she could to small logs in her arms, her steps uneven. Blood darkened the binding around her foot again. He saw it, said nothing, just nodded. When she placed the logs down, as if her effort, not the result, was what mattered. They worked in silence until the wind forced them back inside. By then, the snow had sealed the door halfway. He bolted it shut. The storm had them. For 3 days, it didn't let go. He gave her the bed, took the floor by the stove. She offered to switch. He refused. She didn't ask again. She watched him in the dim orange glow, sleeves rolled, eyes narrowed as he repaired a battered old rifle. He worked slow, reverent, as if the tool deserved his silence, as if scars had to be treated gently, even the metal ones. On the second night she spoke, just above the crackle of the fire. "Why did you stop them?" Storm moaned against. "The shutters." He didn't answer. She turned her face to the flames, thinking that was that. But a minute passed, then 2. Then low and quiet he said, "Because I was watching." The fire hissed as snow melted through a crack in the chimney. Her throat closed. She looked away, tears hot and unwelcome as they ran down her cheeks. She pressed her face to the wall, breathing slow, trying not to make a sound. He didn't move, didn't offer comfort. But the room didn't feel empty. He stood, fed another log to the fire. The shadows danced again, across the rifle, across the wooden walls, across the scar on his left hand. She watched him through damp lashes. And when she finally fell asleep that night, the wind outside no longer sounded like judgment. It sounded like something older, a song the mountain had been singing long before either of them ever arrived. The snow melted slow that year, as if the land itself wasn't sure it wanted to be warm again. Ice retreated from the corners of the fence posts, leaving behind mud and tiny shoots of green. The creek began to whisper again, its frozen silence breaking into murmurs. Birds returned, though not many. She stayed. She swept the cabin in the mornings, boiled water in the cracked kettle, hung sheets to dry in the wind that no longer bit quite so deep. She cooked without recipes, measuring by hand, tasting only once. He always ate what she made, never commented. She didn't need him to. One afternoon, while fixing the torn curtain near the bed, she knelt to reattach a hook and noticed a board that shifted beneath her knee. Not loose, just moved like something hidden beneath it, remembered being touched. She lifted it below, wrapped in oilcloth and still dusted with earth, was a wooden box. Inside, a woman's shawl folded neat, and beside it, a long braid tied with a pale blue ribbon, frayed at the ends. She ran her fingers across the braid, the strands brittle but careful. Not mourning, not curiosity, just acknowledgement. Then she closed the box, lowered it back into the dark, and replaced the floorboard. That night, as the sun bruised the sky and the wind softened into something like memory, the silence shattered. 3 riders came over the ridge. Dust rose behind them. Their laughter came first, thick, drunk, grating. She recognized one of them from town. They dismounted sloppily, boots landing hard on the porch. One knocked against the frame of the door. Another spat onto the wood. Didn't think you. Kept pets. Thorn, one of them slurred. You're going to share her, or charge us for the visit. Her hands trembled only once. She stepped forward. Past the table, I ain't. But the sound of a rifle cocking cut through the evening like thunder in a church. Thorn stood at the threshold. He hadn't raised the gun, not fully, just made the sound. Once. The porch creaked with the weight of hesitation. Then boots shuffled. Men cursed under their breath. The riders left without another word. Dust swallowed them. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. That night. Long after the dishes were stacked and the rocking chair had gone still, she reached into the pocket of the dress she wore the day she was almost hanged. The same dress that still held the smell of frost at the very bottom, against the seam. She found her necklace. It wasn't worth much. A chipped pendant on a thin chain. Her child had once played with it, twisting it in tiny fingers. She stood in the middle of the room, unsure, then walked to the floorboard, lifted it, placed the necklace beside the braid. Not a word was spoken. The next morning, she woke. His coffee mug was already on the table beside hers. The earth had softened by April. The creek ran stronger. The soil smelled alive again, like something waking up after a long, bitter sleep. They worked in tandem now, without needing to speak much. She pulled weeds while he broke the ground. She stitched the torn shoulder of his shirt while he fixed the hinge on the barn door. He built a fence that had never existed before. Though she didn't ask why, she watched the way he measured each post like it meant something. She brushed the mare every morning. The same horse that once made her flinch now leaned into her. Touch. He repaired her boot with one of his old tools, a rounded iron all he hadn't used in years. She offered to help. He said nothing, but left the all out for her to see the next day. That was answer enough. The night the storm came. It arrived like fury, lightning striking so close the cabin windows pulsed white. She'd just set the kettle down when the smell of smoke hit. The barn, she said, already running. He shouted behind her, but she didn't stop. Inside, a calf bawled, trapped by fallen hay and flame. Her shawl caught fire when she leaped across the beam, and her scream split the storm. She clutched the calf's neck and tried to drag it clear, but the smoke blurred everything. Then he was there, Thorn, crashing through the side, coat in hand, smothering the flames, licking her back. He pulled her down into the dirt just as the rafters collapsed in a crackling roar. He didn't yell, didn't curse, just held her there, both of them coughing, both scorched, until the barn gave its last groan and fell to ash. She wept into his shoulder. He said her name for the first time, her real name. Later, inside, her hands shaking as she wrapped cloth around his blistered palm, she told him everything. Not just about the bread, about the man who bought her when she was 12, about the wedding dress she bled in, about the miscarriages no one mourned, about how she'd learned to make her voice quieter than dust, and how silence had become her only kind of safety. He didn't flinch, didn't interrupt. When she finished, she didn't look at him. She just asked, "Why do you care?" He didn't move his burned hand. Just let her wrap it, slow and careful. Then he said, "Because no one ever cared when it mattered." He looked at her, not pitying, not proud, just steady. This time he said, "It matters." The shawl she had worn was folded neatly. By the fire, the edges were blackened, curling like paper. But it still held shape, still held warmth. Outside, the wind stirred the ashes of the barn. Somewhere in the night, the fence they built still stood. The sun rose without hurry that morning, casting gold across the hills like it was finally safe to be gentle again. The barn had long since been rebuilt, smaller, simpler, but it held what mattered. The earth bore crops now, timid green. Rows pushing up from land once choked in frost. The fence still stood. She stood beside the corral, brushing dust from the hem of a white dress she'd stitched in silence over many weeks. He had never seen her working on it, though she used his. Mother's old thread, found in a tin beneath the stove. Around her neck, on a thin leather string, hung a small gold ring, its band worn smooth from generations of skin. He said nothing when he saw her, just saddled the horse and handed her the reins. The ride into town was quiet. The same road where the gallows once stood now bloomed with wildflowers. But she remembered. The rope, the stairs, the sound of boots on wood, and the way no one had spoken for her, except him. And even then, only 5 words. The town had moved on. New gossip replaced old sins. A saloon had opened. The preacher had died. But some of the faces were the same eyes, same silence. They dismounted outside the general store. He waited outside. She walked in, calm and barefoot, just as before, but this time by choice. The shawl was gone. The dirt was gone. Placed 2 coins on the counter, chose her own loaf. Thanked the shopkeep when she turned to leave. A little girl tugged at her skirt, eyes wide, hungry. She knelt, smiled, and pressed the extra roll into the girl's hand. The child didn't speak, just ran off down the street. She stepped outside. Thorne waited, one boot resting on the stirrup, hands easy at his sides. Was pulled low, but not to hide. She climbed into the saddle, didn't need his help. He looked up at her. "You ready to go home?" She didn't nod at first, just looked back at the town, its roofs and windows, its dust and old judgment. Then she smiled and nodded. As the horse turned, sunlight glinted off the ring at her throat. The dress caught the wind, white as clouds. Her hands gripped the reins, steady behind her. No rope, no whispers. Just a loaf of bread tucked safe beneath her arm, paid for, chosen, carried ahead. The trail wound back toward the hills. Home was no longer a place she'd been stolen to. It was a road she chose to ride.